So before I open it up, and I hope people are thinking about questions, I just got one or two to get us started. So maybe just picking up on some of the points that Iain made around the challenges in the maritime sector, getting that off the ground. I'm wondering, Donal, if there's anything from the aviation perspective, where you've been up and running for a bit longer, anything that you think has worked that would help those companies that are operating internationally, where they're dealing with, those different regulatory mechanisms?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge of multiple submissions and slightly different and changing of systems is real. I can't say that issue is getting any easier in aviation, let alone in maritime. So unfortunately, I've nothing to point to in that regard. Aviation may be further along the line than maritime, but it has some of the very same challenges in that it is a sector that is more difficult to abate than many other sectors. And one of the concerns that I have is that there isn't quite an equality in which these things are dealt with. Certainly sectors that are hard to abate, and certainly sectors that are located on islands with no other means of getting off apart from shipping or aircraft need to be particularly focused on that. So I would say spend a lot of time lobbying, talking to regulators, to stakeholders, but also to the political system to advocate the case for a particular focus on a sector. One of the things that Aer Lingus has been involved in with the Department of Transport is the establishment of a Sustainable Aviation Fuel Task Force. It was established early last year, and it's got key stakeholders from the aviation sector, but also from the fuel sector, also from broader business sectors, to inform government and to create a level of expertise at an academic business and business level to inform how policy should be formed around sustainable aviation fuel. So that's the direction I would point other sectors that are hard to debate in to really focus on trying to influence at a policy level.
So it's a work in progress?
Very much so.
Okay, yeah. All right. We'll see if there are any questions from the floor. If you could raise your hand. We have a gentleman here. If you could just introduce yourself and say where you're from.
Hi, Darren McAdam O'Connell. I'm the coordinator of the Cork Transport and Mobility Forum. I have loads of questions, but rather than take over, I might just ask three that are very linked to each other, and you can come back to me later if there's time for the others. Primarily to Donal. As Iain said, we are an island. We have to get on and off of it. Do you think, first part of the question, do you think that there needs to be a different regime for, say, necessary air travel? That would be the transatlantic down to South America, the transcontinental, but also the inter-island, versus the aviation, which is probably blatantly unnecessary, the short hops within Europe where rail can or could easily, with appropriate interventions, and I'm going to speak to that in a second, take over. Second, in terms of the sustainable aviation fuels, you said there isn't enough. I would contend there can't ever be enough. And this can't be the only answer, because sustainable aviation fuel is basically fungible with food. We're already at the situation where the world's largest food crop, the American maize crop, only 1% is eaten by people. 40% produces biofuels.
Can I deal with those two? Because I'll forget them if I don't. Yeah. To start on necessary travel versus unnecessary travel. I don't want to get emotional about anything, but I know on every flight we have people going to funerals, going to weddings, going to christenings. So I don't determine, and I don't think anyone determines what necessary and is necessary travel and unnecessary travel. To your point about differentiation between islands, other Malta, for example, the Canary Islands, for example, have successfully argued at a European level for a slight difference in approach, given their dependence on tourism and given their island status. So there is potentially room around the edges to do something that is bespoke, but I'd be really careful about setting a policy that determines what is justified travel and not. With regard to SAF and feedstocks and production of SAF, I agree with you that SAF shouldn't be in competition, or aviation shouldn't be in competition with food for the purpose of feedstock for generation of sustainable aviation fuel. I think increasingly the feedstocks that are deployed, agri-waste, forestry waste, used cooking oil for I suppose second generation SAF, aren't competing with food production, and they shouldn't. But the real opportunity is actually in the third generation in power to liquid, eSAF, and harnessing wind energy, generation of hydrogen, and producing SAF in that way. So in a way I agree with you. We should never be in competition with food. We should use the current feedstock that is available to build I suppose the capacity to generate SAF, but the future is definitely in eSAF and PTL, and that's the step change that needs to happen. But for that to happen, there needs to be enormous investment. Capital investment by governments, by the European Union, in order to create that capability to produce SAF at that scale. But if you look at the journey to net zero, it's the only way of getting there, because unfortunately the laws of physics are such that propelling a tube into the air and travelling thousands of miles is not going to be deliverable in another way in the short term.
Yeah. The third part of my question was addressing that, what's a necessary journey and what isn't. We can talk all we like about replacing air with more sustainable transport options, but, and this is maybe addressed partially to Iain, but mostly to policymakers, in that in my role as the Coordinator of Transport Mobility Forum, I'm travelling a lot around Europe, and I am supposed to do that sustainably. I have done it, and I can tell you, despite what my nice cheery Instagram ones of being on a bike in Spain and all that, it's really difficult, and we're not doing enough to make journeys which should be quicker and easier than flying by other means possible. We are not bringing enough people on boats. You said, Iain, that almost everything except in the room except the people came here on a boat. I know I talked to you outside about this. When I went to Spain for a European project, it's €500 for me to bring a bike on a boat. That's not the marginal cost of bringing a bike on a boat. When I get to Spain and I want to go on a railway, the rail links stop at borders, and we find that all over Europe. The EU is putting a lot of money into Rail Baltica, but it isn't doing this, the hard grunt of making sure that we have a European rail network, not just a regional or national one. And do you think that that's part of the answer as well?
Well, the EU are looking at multimodality, and they're looking at ways to transition between multiple different modes of transport. That has, from an aviation perspective, that has issues, but that is the reality of what's coming. Can I just slightly off point, but draw a link between shipping and aviation for a moment? And I mentioned when I was speaking that SAF, provided it's of the right quality, should be acceptable no matter where it comes from. To give you an example, if Aer Lingus flying from San Francisco to Dublin, if we upload high quality eSAF in San Francisco into an aircraft and fly to Dublin, it doesn't qualify for the EU SAF mandate. It doesn't qualify. If I do a deal with Iain here and at scale transport that same SAF onto a ship halfway across the world to Dublin, put it in an aircraft flying from Dublin to San Francisco, it does qualify for the SAF mandate. So there's a lot that's at a policy level that is simply, I suppose, nicest way of putting it, is not very well thought through. So I think part of the simplification and the clarity that the Draghi report was outlining really needs to be brought to bear on some of the policies that have been established in the last European Commission that I think need to be refined in the current Commission period. Sorry, that's slightly off point, but it's...
Thanks, Donal. We might see if there are any more questions there. We have, there's somebody down the back with the mic. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, how are things? Thanks to the panel there for your discussions. They're very interesting. And I suppose my name is Brendan Moore and I work for Revo Co-op, but it's kind of a personal view first and then kind of going back to the company view. So I suppose our policy makers, I suppose, building resilience into kind of strategy or strategic thinking. I suppose I'm all for sustainability. I live in the west of Ireland, building a house, all, electrified, decarbonised, through electrification. And I suppose I built 2017, the last time we had a long-term, I suppose, outage was 2000. So I said, look, what's going to happen? So we got Storm Olwen this year. We had to actually go to a hotel with 2 kids under 3, couldn't have a cup of tea, no heat in the house. My parents had a gas hob and a fire in the house, so had to go up to get a flask of tea. And I suppose it was replicated, throughout the West Coast there. And look, we're in the West, we're kind of used to that because maybe 2 or 3 times a year we always have outages, and that was fine with us. But the fact that the whole population got outages, it didn't get back to maybe 4 days. We were lucky. There was 3 or 4 weeks for people that couldn't get their power back. No water, no power, no heat. And I suppose, so looking at that, I'm looking at now getting a gas hob and putting a diesel generator into the house because I have to, because of future, mitigation. But I suppose when you go back to the co-op and you're talking to farmers and they've all been through this now on a wider scale than maybe it was more 50, 60,000 people that have this every 2 or 3 times a year. They had it for long terms. And you're saying, well, we have to electrify, and to decarbonise and invest in this. And they're saying, well, this is what happened here. Look, we had no heat. Couldn't power the farms. How can we invest in this? And I suppose, just kind of, devil's advocate. Look, I'm all for decarbonisation and that, but I suppose, has that thought been there? Because that's going to affect a lot of people from that incident alone. Million households, farmers, businesses, had that issue this year, and you're trying to convince them to electrify. And I suppose putting it out there, what's the next steps in that, or have policymakers thought about, look, the grid at the moment or the network still isn't fully decarbonised, has to have, solid or fossil fuels and things like that. So maybe is it worthwhile thinking of having, all these fancy new houses that have all electrification in them, but no alternative heating systems if the grid goes down? So that's, I suppose, my question out there. Look, it's not an easy question, but thinking of kind of a high-level thought there. So
that's quite a broad question. I suppose it cuts across a lot, but Paul might want to comment on it.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Look, I think it's important to remember that, I have an all-electric house, same as you, but when my power went during Storm Ione, my neighbour who had a kerosene boiler, their heating didn't work either. The Maxall up the road didn't work either because we were out for 2 or 3 days. So it's not, if you have an all-electric house, you're not being penalised when electricity goes out. It goes out for everyone. And I have a Super Sir out the back and I have a bottle of gas. Go for it. You should, of course, right? And I wouldn't feel guilty about the 3 or 4 days in the year where you need to run the diesel generator. If you have family, if you've got kids, if you've got vulnerable people, cows to milk, go for it. The emissions from a diesel generator are tiny in relation to the grand scheme of things, but the hardship is really big, So I wouldn't be vilifying anyone at all who invests in a diesel generator or the old bottle of gas. I have a bottle of gas that I use for the summer barbecue. I probably get more use of it out during the super surge during the winter outages, and go for it. It's not a big deal. We sometimes overestimate the impacts of really small actions that are important, and we underestimate the impacts of others. So what I always advise to my neighbours and anyone who will listen, we need to be more prepared for these things. And this is not new. You mentioned neighbours and parents and grandparents. This is stuff that generation before us used to have to deal with anyway. Having a diesel generator, or having a bottle of gas or a Super Sir or a gas hob is a really good idea. What has happened over the last 20 years, I suppose, Brendan, is that we've taken the security of supply of electricity for granted because it became very, very good, all right? I remember when I was growing up in the 90s, the security supply of electricity was far worse than what it was now, and there was no renewables or an all electric system on the power system. So I think as a society, and I thought there was an information pack, Martina, from the Commission about a month or two ago about local resilience, taking responsibility ourselves for our own actions. The government can't do everything. And people who need to take responsibility for their own actions have a bottle of gas out the back. If you have an electric car, maybe you might be able to do the two-way charging thing. That's very good. If you're a farmer, have a PTO shaft or whatever. So these are not new things. These are things that people used to do. But the storm events are going to get more, unfortunately. And we do need to prepare for these events. And that preparation, hopefully we'll never need it. But I wouldn't be guilty, Brendan, about the minuscule carbon pollution that comes with running a generator for a few hours when you need it. It's about people as well.
Thanks, Paul. That's a great answer. I think we have somebody here.
Hi, my name is Anita. I'm a Master's in Energy Management student at TED, former DIT. So my question is kind of a personal opinion and a question for both Paul and Maria. We have been talking about climate change and emissions reduction since morning. And according to Paul, electricity, power generation is a huge contributor to the large amount of emissions we do have in Ireland and around the EU. We've been talking about a lot of solutions, but there's a particular solution I have been reading up about that seems to be overlooked in Ireland. So according to the best of my knowledge, according to Ireland's 1999 Electricity Regulation Act, nuclear energy has been banned. And if you look at nuclear energy for electricity production, if we're saying we do want net zero emissions, renewable energy, as we look at it, wind energy is very variable. Ireland being an island on its own, we do have a lot of wave resources that could be tapped in, but I think that's under development. And if we're looking at wind, there are not enough battery storages, to the best of my knowledge, for the amount of energy we need to stabilize the grid. So my question is, why is Ireland not using or looking into using nuclear energy for electricity generation? And if they are, how far are they in reconsidering this ban? Because personally, I feel that would be a good solution towards reducing the carbon emissions.
Paul, you happy to take that?
Yeah, so nuclear is illegal in Ireland. There's two countries in Europe, Ireland and Austria, where the development of nuclear electricity is prohibited, going back to the 1990 Electricity Act. We can import nuclear, of course, from the UK, and we will be importing nuclear from France. That's fine, and that's okay. The type of nuclear that we would need in Ireland is a very specific type of power plant, which would need to be small, reflecting the size of our economy. So really, large kind of Hinkley Point B situations don't work in Ireland. They're too large, okay? And we see Ireland doesn't have a great track record in building very large infrastructure. Just look at the hospital over the road. Imagine putting a nuclear reactor into the middle of that and where that would end up. So when it comes to nuclear technology, we need small modular nuclear reactors, and unfortunately, you cannot commercially buy that technology today. So Donal and Iain run about e-methanol and e-SAF. You can kind of buy little bits of that today. But the only small modular nuclear reactors that we have in the planet today are either on military submarines, which have a very different risk profile to civilian power plants, and there's one in China. So, and we probably won't, those things won't come on the market for about another 10 or 15 years, okay? So personally, I'm all in favour of anything that's low carbon. I don't mind if it's, because when I look at the challenges that we're facing in terms of planetary collapse of food systems, of extreme weather, I'm happy to take the risks that come with nuclear. But the honest answer is that the technology that we need in Ireland isn't commercially available yet. If you can't buy it, you can't build it. and it's probably something for 10 or 15 years' time. It's often put forward, let's say, by the Royal Academy of Engineers that we should go down nuclear, but they don't acknowledge the fact that we have to wait 15 years for it to be developed. Most power plants in Ireland are already 30 years old. 30 years old for a person is okay. For a ship, it's probably terrible. For a power plant, it's awful. Okay, so we can't wait on whether nuclear may or may not develop. Lean into our strengths, our renewables. If nuclear does become available in 2040 or 2050, just stop building wind farms.
Thank you, Paul. Can I see if there are any more questions? Yeah, we have a gentleman here.
Yeah, Kieran Hayes, consultant. Just a question for Iain, just in relation to the maritime sector, and you spoke about ethanol and the challenges around that, but what about hydrogen? Is there any developments there? I'm conscious now that there are 3 elements in hydrogen and the cost is prohibitive in each. The challenges are prohibitive in each one, the cost of production, then transport, and then the issue of storage. But I'm conscious also that there are some developments in the area, and has the maritime sector looked at that in terms of the medium to longer term?
They have looked at it. The energy density is a problem with hydrogen, so you end up potentially using some, what is the term, something like ammonia or methanol as to hold the hydrogen element. Hydrogen itself, storage on board ships, will be possible, I think, in maybe small scale operations. I think if you want to scale up the amount of energy that you will need to, say, a transatlantic voyage, it doesn't scale up well just because of its energy density and the amount of storage space it will use. But hydrogen is going to be the element we use, but it may be in a molecule of ammonia or it might be in a molecule of methanol.
Great, thank you, Iain. Are there any more questions? Oh, here at the front.
Yeah, also to Iain, so you of course you explained very vividly the, let's say, your pains with the regulatory system, and actually I wanted to ask because the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, has just come up with a proposal for regulating, let's say, or for giving and setting incentives for a decarbonization pathway of global shipping in a more uniform system. I'm personally not a big expert of that, but I've just had a quick look and it sounded quite interesting because there's a technology pathway, and if you're not on track, the money you're paying into a fund is being used in the industry to accelerate or to advance or to help also those companies who are in need of help in their decarbonization pathway. So what is your analysis? Would that be a better approach? Because as I understand, the inclusion of shipping into the EU ETS is also, in a sense, conditional on the current lack of any global approach of, in a sense, setting incentives for decarbonizing that sector. And there could, of course, be the option of taking shipping again out of the EU ETS if there were a truly convincing global approach. So any thoughts on this initiative?
Lots. I'm glad to hear you say that the intention is to take shipping out of EU ETS if the IMO steps up and has a corresponding plan to decarbonise. They have unwillingly agreed to the new system that I said their greenhouse gas from MEPC 83. It's loosely based on energy, it's loosely based on fuel EU, which we're already now, this is our first year. So the penalties involved in the IMO system are similar to or order of magnitude more than ETS, depending on where you are, because it's a two-tier system. It's quite a difficult little calculation, and it's stepping up quite fast. The penalty in the first year versus 2035 is a tenfold difference. I would say that ETS has no chance in the maritime industry of decarbonisation. It should be taken out as soon as everybody's happy and the IMO steps up. Fuel EU has a good chance of decarbonising the marine industry. And that is why I think the IMO has copied it essentially and put their own slant on it. So it's a worldwide system. This would, I would like to think, take away all of the international ETS trading systems, and we would just come in under one umbrella. How we comply with it, though, you're saying that there's incentives. The incentives are set at a very low bar. I would have to be burning 85% methanol, green methanol, to get get the costs back, or 100% bio with a good energy density, and I can't do either of those things at the moment. To the two-tier systems, in order for me to comply with it in 2028, I've worked out I would need to burn 50% B30, so 30% biofuel, and 50% of the fuel I would have to burn would have to be that B30. That's the first year. And that straight away by the second year, I would be out and bursting through the limits straight away. Thank you.
Thanks, Iain. And before I go back to the floor, I might just ask Andrea a question, if that's okay. You mentioned in your presentation that something like 80% of the largest companies have not set any decarbonisation targets. And why do you think that is, or what's needed to move the dial there, that it becomes more part of the mainstream business thinking, if you like?
Yeah, so this was some research done by Allied Offsets. It's probably about 2 years old now. I think it's the difficulty of doing it. I think there's a lack of consensus on what a net zero pathway looks like for companies. The sort of main methodology setter is called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. They don't have methodologies for all sectors, and a lot of companies don't support what they do. So they aren't following those. So first of all, they set the pathways by sector, and then they set the pace that you need to decarbonise based on a sector, and how much you need to decarbonise by, say, 2050 or sooner. And the boundaries. So does it need to be a scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? And, you know, there's a lot of companies that just do not know how to achieve those goals. So if you have to commit to interim targets or short-term targets, which you need to do under SBTI, you've got to commit to a target in, 2030, 2040, 2050, and you don't know how you're going to do it. So I think, it's just really is the extent of challenges. And then I think there's a bit of inertia, frankly, in the system as well. There's no penalty for not setting voluntary targets.
So do you think is the onus on policymakers to drive that, or is it the industry itself needs to organise itself to help the different kind of sectors move forward?
I think both, but I would definitely say the industry needs to stand together and stand up for what they need to make decarbonising, to be part of the Paris Agreement. Soon after the Paris Agreement was signed, there was like a real flurry of activities of companies saying that they're going to support net zero and be part of the Paris Agreement. That's what you want. You want that type of, rallying of activity. But since then, there's just been so many challenges, from doing it the wrong way, not being sure how to do it, trying to do it, setting the targets, finding out you then don't know how to do it. And there's been a real sort of dampening down of action. So that's where we are at the moment. And there's also, unfortunately, been a lot of court cases for companies who've made claims which have been seen to be greenwashing. It's a bit hard because I think sometimes they were genuine sort of attempt to mislead, but in many, many cases they weren't. There's companies doing what they thought was the right thing to do at the time, like saying that they're carbon neutral. There were no rules to not do that. So that's a problem. There aren't sufficient rules. There's not enough safeguards for companies for what you can do, and therefore there's a reluctance to act unless it's by regulation.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Andrea. If we want to go to the question here, yeah, thank you.
Philip Fedosov, a question for Donal. Is it realistic that the investment will be made in second or third or fourth generation SAFs before the first generation SAFs based on agricultural products will reach a pushback point due to biodiversity, the impacts of biodiversity, deforestation, or the impacts that they're having on food supply? Do you think that there'll be any incentive to make that investment?
Well, the mandate requires it. So the EU mandate requires a proportion from 2020 onwards of ESAF or PTL. So that in itself will drive the sector to produce a mandated level of SAF. Airlines will have to purchase it. However, I think in order for that industry, that is more complicated. Production of SAF of that type is more complicated than HEFA-based or current SAF that's available. So that will take a lot more capital investment in order to get that industry up to scale. To answer your question, well, will that investment happen? I think it'll only happen if it's de-risked from the producer perspective. There's many in the chain of investment. You go from feasibility study to offtake agreement, and there's a lot that happens in terms of capital investment between those 2 points. And ultimately, a fuel producer wants to get to an offtake agreement, basically a commitment by an airline to purchase fuel at a certain point. But they also need certainty that that purchase will happen at that point. And that needs to be de-risked at a policy level. So financial instruments need to be used, for example, contracts for difference need to be used at a policy level, at a government level, to de-risk that situation for the fuel producer so that they know that at the end of this particularly intensive capital investment, that they have a commitment that they can rely on and therefore justify their investment. So to answer your question, I think it'll only happen if there is a policy change that enables it to happen. The Inflation Reduction Act in the States is an example of what could be done. That involved significant taxation benefits or incentivization for investment in sustainable aviation fuel. And we, as an entity, Aer Lingus, as part of IAG, we've entered into a PTL ESAF agreement with a California-based company called 12 last year, which is enabled by that sort of incentivization. So that agreement and their commitment to invest the capital required to produce the SAF is enabled by incentivization. So to answer your question, it'll only happen if there's policy change.
Thanks, Donal. We have another question, Christian.
Thank you. Christian Feehan from the Department of the Environment. Thanks very much to the panellists for those very interesting presentations. This kind of ties in what you were talking about, Andrea, but my question is for Donal about, you were talking about your targets, your decarbonisation targets are the same as the States, so net zero or climate neutrality by 2050. And obviously we got a report card this morning from the EPA in terms of how we're progressing towards that 2050 target. And I'm curious to know how Aer Lingus is doing on its trajectory, and how do you assess your progress on a year-by-year basis so that you can take that corrective action if it's needed to get towards net zero?
Yeah, so at a minimum, the SAF mandate is critical. So, for example, this year we've mandated use of SAF of 2% at an EU level. That rises to 6% by 2030, and it begins to include an ESAF component from then onwards. At Aer Lingus, we have an ambition that goes above and beyond that. IAG, the group of which we're a part, has ambition to power 10% of its flights using sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. So we're on a trajectory that can get there, but it needs SAF to be more available and at more affordable prices in that period of time. How we measure our carbon intensity is an industry standard measure called carbon per passenger kilometre, and we're on a declining trajectory on an annual basis in terms of our carbon intensity measured per passenger kilometre, and we measure that and test it on a monthly basis. We also see, through the combination of all the levers I spoke about earlier, a point at which not only will our carbon per passenger kilometre continue to increase, but our net carbon emissions will decline in aggregate at a point in the future, and that's obviously necessary to achieve net zero by 2050. But we see that happening in the early 2030s, provided the most important component of its delivery in the form of SAF is available, and available at affordable prices. And the reason I say affordable, that's not directed at profitability of airlines or the aviation sector. That's directed at the ability to do that, but also invest in new aircraft, new technology, so that the combination of those two levers are delivering at the same time. One without the other is not going to get there. And then, not to dwell on my frustration of earlier, if we didn't have to fly the circuitous routes we had to fly, we could knock 10% off in the morning.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. A question over here.
Hi, Orla McCarthy from the Central Statistics Office. I just have a question for you, Iain. I really don't know anything about this, but what about the big metal sales on ships, and they've been investigated, and obviously ships have been sailing for years. Do you think, where's that technology, and what kind of impact do you think it might have?
It has an acronym too, WASP. Not WASP, WASP, Wind Assisted Sail Propulsion. It is being trialled. It is working quite well, I think I said, on transoceanic, so transatlantic voyages, where there's a nice constant bearing for the ship and a nice constant wind from a particular direction. I'm not a navigator, I'm an engineer. I'm told east-west, west-east is very different, and the routes are really well laid out. People have been doing it for a long time. It will suit some ship types. It's suiting something like a tanker with large amounts of deck space that is doing nothing else. Car carriers, interesting, one of the greenest ships at the moment has 4 sails on it and uses, I think, methanol. Unfortunately, it transports Airbus parts around. It is being trialled.
Unfortunately,
fortunately, it is being trialled in a big way. We estimate on our ships, because of our trade, we have limited deck space. The deck space is our working space. It would be like trying to park a sail on top of the bed of a truck where you need to carry cargo. If we could fit one, we could get something in the region of 7 to 8, best case scenario, 10% of our thrust. We won't get much more than that, so it would be an element, and we are looking at it. I'm party to 3 different studies at the moment using 3 different types of sail. Yes, it is being trialled.
Do we have any more questions from the floor? Let's just see, is there anyone else before we come back to you? I don't see any other. Yeah, we'll go back to you then. Thank you.
I wanted to wait till everybody else got a time before I went back in again, but I do have a question for Dr. Deane. Excellent presentation. Like you, I'm looking at those 15-minute sections all the time on our production and all around Europe. And I couldn't agree more that the ability to import the electricity from the UK is incredibly beneficial environmentally and economically. But would you also agree it would be even better if we were producing 2 or 3 times our wind production? Now, that wouldn't necessarily reduce significantly the amount of power we're importing from the UK, because that happens when the wind just isn't blowing here, because just like our grid is too small for nuclear, our island is too small to have different wind regimes at the one time. But it would mean that the times when we weren't importing, we would be exporting a lot more. And also, no matter how good the wind is, and no matter how much surplus electricity there is in the UK, we always have about 10% generation of turning turbines, whether they're in hydroelectricity or fossil fuels, and I assume that's for grid stability. Do you think that we need to invest in some sort of alternative or sustainable turning turbines for that grid stability, be it part of storage with hot rocks or hot water or something, in order that we can get that last 10%. We do have the ability to import and good wind.
And thank you. Look, wind is our renewables are our only fuel here. It's our great resource today. 40% of our electricity comes from wind. And actually, the conversation that we had at the moment, Danny McCoy's talking about competitiveness, and that often leads to conversations about, well, should we drill for more gas? Should we drill for more oil in Ireland? But we've tried that, right? We've drilled 141 wells off the coast of Ireland over the last 30 years. We've never hit commercial oil. We've hit commercial gas 5 times, and actually 3 of those were in Cork. So, right, actually 4 of those were in Cork off Kinsale. That's the same odds as playing roulette, okay? So finding those fuels. But so we don't have stuff under the ground, but above the ground in terms of wind is abundant, and it's ours, it's secure, it's safe, it's clean, it can't be interfered with geopolitically. And if we can achieve what the government has set out to do in 2030 in terms of our climate action plan, in terms of build out of renewables, it will be tricky, but that will allow us to generate the same amount of electricity as finding 3 new Corrib gas fields. That's awesome. That's incredible, right? So, and that's the prize that we're aiming towards. And in relation to Danny's comments and Una's comments earlier this morning, not only is that clean and safe and secure, but it's competitive with the price of natural gas. So it ties into the idea of affordability. Cheap gas allowed the European economy to develop, but cheap gas is gone, okay, because of Europe, because of the interruption of Russia into Ukraine. Cheap anything typically comes with bad something else. So cheap power came with the political leverage. But renewables don't come with that baggage. Now, what renewables will do, and we have to manage our expectations here, they won't drop electricity prices dramatically back to where they were in 2012. That's not going to happen. But what renewables will do, they'll have a moderate reduction on electricity prices, but a significant reduction on price volatility. And that's where our competitive lies in Ireland. If you look back at electricity prices in Ireland since, let's say, the 2010, Ireland never had the cheapest electricity. We had stable electricity, and we have lots of other good things to offer in Ireland in terms of tax, workforce, smart people, etc. So I think I would push back on the idea that we can't have all 3. The fuel that we have gives us those 3 things that we need. Now, you're spot on in terms of the grid, in terms of how do we keep things stable. If I was to say another bit of good news, Martina, as well as the good news that I started off earlier on, is that Ireland is probably a decade ahead of most other European countries in terms of managing the variable renewables within the power system that we have. We're way ahead of the Spaniards, way ahead of the French. We're good at this, we're used to this, we have experience and we have knowledge like this. We are going to need those spinning chunks of metal. You see the incredible story down in Moneypoint, which used to be Ireland's largest polluter or second largest polluter. Now it's adding stability. There's still a big turning chunk of metal inside in that building, but now it's injecting stability into the grid. We need a bit more of that. We can solve that, and things like batteries will solve around that problem as well. So I think in Ireland, we're on the right track when it comes to doing what we're doing with renewables and doing what we're doing, particularly in the power sector. The challenge, I think, really is how do you scale it up now to a magnitude that's big enough, as you talked about doubling and tripling, and how do we do it at a speed, I think, that's quick enough. So the prize is there. What we're doing is correct. The challenge, I think, is just to try and do it quickly enough now.
Thanks, Paul. Well, we're coming towards the end of the slot for the Q&A, so I might just ask the panellists one last question. So if you had the power, whether that be, maybe minister is the wrong word, maybe it's the EU commissioner, you had the power to change one thing to simplify and address some of those issues that some of you have talked about in your talks and we heard earlier this morning, what would that one thing be? So if somebody is ready to start, rather than me picking on someone. Iain, do you want to go?
Don't pick on anyone.
Yeah. You looked at me there like you were ready to go.
Clarity. I think all industry just likes clarity. If you tell me what the future fuel will be, I can then plan around that. I can build a ship that will carry it. I can build an engine that will consume it, if that is required, or whatever is needed. So it's make the fuel and I will use it. I cannot, and I don't think I can be expected to invent and procure fuels and make and distribute them around Europe. The trouble with our particular trade is we're bouncing in small amounts around different places. I can't organise in one specific place for my source of sustainable e-methanol, green methanol. So a bit of clarity, but if you could supply me with something green, I can use that straight away.
Okay. No big ask there then?
No big ask.
No. Andrea?
Yeah, so sticking to carbon markets, I would say alignment on the credits themselves, so alignment on methodologies, so that you can build fungibility. If you can have more fungibility, you have more investment and you can scale it, scale emission reductions in effect.
Okay, thank you. Donal?
2 things.
2. There's always one.
Massive investment to incentivise SAF production in the European Union, and implementation of a single air traffic management system across the European Union.
Okay. Again, not a big ask at all. Paul?
I think the narratives that the way we talk about energy, I think it needs to change. It's not about saving the planet, it's about making life better for people in Ireland. When we look at renewables, what it can give, yes, it reduces emissions, but it gives jobs, it gives security, it gives affordability, it gives competitiveness, it gives geopolitical security. I think the focusing on the wider benefits of those things is something that would be really helpful. As Una said again this morning, people need to come on this journey with us. And I think that's very important.
And a lot of what we're doing in the department, we recognise that. I think that's part of the messaging. We've to get away from targets and we're failing. It's all about the benefits that all of this is bringing to society. And it's not just in terms of the environment, but it's cost effectiveness, it's health as well, all these other benefits. We need to really scale up how we talk about that. So I'd like to thank the panel, which I think for a really interesting session this afternoon. I certainly learned a lot. So I'd like to start a round of applause maybe to thank them.